Welcome to the home of 100 to 1 Faith TV. I'm Larry Gent, and this is the message for Grace Heartwood United Methodist Church on November 14th, 2021. It's Veterans Sunday, and today we celebrate the service of all who served their country. We especially remember the service of the people of the great land, Alaska. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord, today we honor the warriors who stood in the gap for us. Because of their sacrifice, we can rest in peace and safety. Because of their service, we enjoy the fragile gift of freedom. Grant us all a portion of that warrior spirit, that we might stand in the gap for those who cannot stand for themselves. Amen. Our psalm for the day is the Shepherd's Song, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The New Testament reading is Galatians 3, First Nations Version. It no longer matters whether you are tribal members or wisdom keepers, slaves or free, male or female, for in Creator sets free the chosen one, you are all one people. And since you belong to the chosen one, you are a descendant of the Father of many nations, and the ones who share in the blessing of the promise Creator made to him. Our gospel reading is John 10, again, the First Nations Version. I speak again from my heart, Jesus said. I am the gate for the sheep. All who put themselves before me are thieves and outlaws, false shepherds. My sheep do not listen to them. I am the gate for the sheep. The ones who enter by me will be safe and well cared for. Following the shepherd, they will go in and out and find good food to eat. Thieves enter only to take away life and steal what is not theirs, and to bring to ruin all they cannot have. I have come to give the good life, a life that overflows with beauty and harmony. I am the good shepherd, the one who watches over the sheep. I will lay down my life for them. The Old Testament reading is Nehemiah 4. Our enemies plotted to come and fight against us and to cause confusion. So we prayed to our God and set a watch as protection day and night. I stood up and said, do not be afraid. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your kin, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So half of the people worked on construction, and half held the spears, shields, bows, and body armor. Each labored on the work with one hand, and with the other held a weapon. In 1935, General Billy Mitchell spoke to Congress about the future of aviation. He was a visionary who saw clearly the things that were soon to come. Like the prophets of the Old Testament, he spoke of things that were yet to be. And, like the prophets of old, people hated and ridiculed him for it. Two bicycle mechanics managed to get a rickety glider to fly 852 feet in 59 seconds. It was December 1903. 10 years later, daring souls took to the sky in a world war, the war to end all wars. Sadly, today we know it as World War I. But military leaders were not convinced air power would ever be as important as boots on the ground or ships in the sea. In 1921, Mitchell called for a public showdown. The Navy provided a disabled German battleship, damaged and disabled, but designed to be unsinkable. After a barrage of big guns from the Navy and Marines, it sat unmoved on the waves. In 21 minutes of bombardment, Mitchell and his pilots sent it to the bottom of the sea. Far from convincing his superior officers, the exercise left them embarrassed and angry. They called it a publicity stunt, little more than a parlor trick. Like the prophets of old, he called them out in public. So they demoted him, court-martialed him, and stripped him of his pay. He was forced to resign from the army. But before he left, he spoke to Congress. He said, in the future, the one who controlled Alaska would control the world. The nation laughed him to scorn. The best aircraft could only fly 500 miles round trip, and Alaska was 1,000 miles from anywhere one way. But 6 years later, no one was laughing as Axis power bombed Pearl Harbor from the air. 6 months later, they repeatedly bombed the Navy and Army installations in Dutch Harbor on Unalaska Island, Alaska. The enemy never attempted to take Hawaii, but they did take the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska. And so Alaska became the only U.S. soil occupied by enemy forces since the War of 1812. It is an ugly story. War is truly hell. There were just 44 native souls living on Attu. They were taken prisoner without a shot being fired. Half of them died of disease or starvation in captivity. It gets worse. Our own federal government rounded up more than 800 other Aleutian Islanders for their own protection and moved them to internment camps, 1,500 miles away. More than 100 of them died in captivity, and most of the survivors never returned. Now, the Aleutian Islands are volcanic rocks in the Bering Sea of the Arctic Ocean. The landscape is harsh and unforgiving, yet those islands have been continuously inhabited by traditional people living in harmony with their land for at least 10,000 years. All of that ended during World War II because the enemy recognized that the Alaskan islands were unsinkable aircraft carriers from which they could control the world. The Pacific theater of World War II was brutal and ferocious. History books and movies tell stories of the battles of Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, the Philippines, Okinawa, and others. But scarcely mentioned is the battle for American soil on Attu Island. The fighting there was so fierce that 500 lives were lost when they reclaimed Kiska Island, and by that point, the enemy had already withdrawn under the cover of darkness. But landmines and booby traps still exacted a terrible toll. The war in the Pacific ended in 2 flashes as hot as the surface of the sun and the ominous rise of mushroom clouds. But that also marked the beginning of the Cold War. The Aleutian Islands were much closer to the Soviet Union than the U.S. mainland. They reach all the way across the international date line into another hemisphere. And so Alaska is both the westernmost and easternmost state in the Union. It would have been too difficult to protect peaceful people so far away, so the people of Attu were not even allowed to visit their homeland, not until just 5 years ago. In 2016, the descendants of those islanders finally got to go home. It was just a brief visit, but they gathered grass from the island to make traditional baskets. They brought back stones and scoops of earth so their children and aged loved ones could touch their homeland. They brought only one gift with them to Attu. It was a cross consecrated in a church. They erected that cross on the ruins of their village church. It might be amazing that they would feel such devotion to the church when their lives had been so disrupted by Christian people. But the story of their church started almost 200 years ago. An Orthodox priest named Father John Venyaminoff was appointed to care for the souls of Alaska, an area so vast that to visit his circuit required more than 14,850 miles by ship, kayak, dog sled, and foot. Now, Amianek was a product of his time, but you cannot fault a man for that. He believed the native people were godless pagans, but he was a deeply caring man. He invented an alphabet for the Aleut language and translated scriptures into their tongue. When smallpox broke out in the Aleutians, more than half the population died. They turned to powerful shamans, but they were helpless to stem the tide. So Venyaminoff traveled 1,500 miles in a solo kayak, delivering smallpox vaccines to the Aleut people. That gift of love in action is what built the church on Attu. And that is why the people erected a cross there. When Alaska was under attack, others followed that example. Major Marvin Muktuk Marston single-handedly recruited Native Alaskans to serve in the Alaska Territorial Guard as volunteers with the U.S. Army. When they were issued equipment and uniforms, he traveled hundreds of miles by dog team and on foot, traveling solo across the wilderness, just like Father Veniaminoff before him. When the army refused to recognize their service, he would not let it drop. He wrote a book to honor their war efforts. He worked to abolish Alaskan segregation laws and insisted that Native people be included in drafting the Alaska State Constitution. That's just what people do in Alaska, and I think that's because warriors have always been drawn to that great land. Warriors always stand in the gap for those who cannot stand for themselves. No matter the distance, no matter the cost, no matter the danger, they always trust God and post a watch. That's what Christ the Good Shepherd did for lost sheep like us. And that is what Christ still does for the lost sheep of this world. Oh, and that is still what followers of Christ, warriors of Christ, like you, do in this world. Thank God for warriors like Veniaminoff and Marston. Thank God for all the warriors who stood up and posted a watch to defend that great land. And thank God for warriors like you who pray and post a watch.